Put your hands together for Steve Zina.
Thank you. Before we get started, I wanted to get a quick show of hands to kind of get a feel for the room. Who's like never used Ember before? Okay. Who's like used it but not a lot? Okay. And people that have like used it a lot are pretty comfortable. Okay. About half an hour. All right. It's good to know. All right. So I'm Steve Cezina. I'm a front-end developer at RTD, the public transit agency here in town. And you can find me on Slack, Twitter, GitHub, everything as Steve SZC. And then David is going to be coming up here in a little while to kind of finish off the back 9 of the talk. David, do you want to introduce yourself?
In addition to my business, I'm also part of the Ember learning team. You can find me at
Cool. So yeah, so we are here to talk about Ember 3.0 and beyond. So just to kind of start from the very base level, Ember is a front-end framework, JavaScript framework for building ambitious web applications. So it's the kind of thing you would use to build a web app that's got complex user interactions, multiple pages, workflows, that kind of thing. Probably wouldn't use it to build like a marketing page or that kind of thing, but it's super useful and super productive for building more complicated apps. Ember has been around since like 2011, so it's survived a lot of the churn in the JavaScript ecosystem. There's a lot of really big apps built on it that have been around for a long time. So like LinkedIn is built on it, the PlayStation Store is built on it, a whole bunch of other stuff, big stuff that's built on it. So that's Ember, and we're here to talk about Ember 3.0. So Ember 3.0 is obviously the third release in Ember's lifetime. Had early days was pre 1.0, and then went into 2.0, which has got us to like where we are now. So we're like at the end of the 2.0 era right now, about to head into 3.0. So Ember 3.0 is coming out in like 2 weeks, so February 12th. So it's coming pretty soon. And we'll talk about what's changing. So Ember takes like a pretty unique approach with its big major releases. Most frameworks will use major version bumps to make pretty major API changes. In the general programming ecosystem, we've seen like Angular, for example, go from the Angular.js, Angular 1 framework to Angular 2 and beyond. And that cutover was basically a new framework. There was no forward compatibility from Angular 1 to Angular 2. It was basically a new thing. In the Python world, when Python went from 2 to 3, it pretty much fractured the community. And you still got people that are Python 2 developers and people that have moved on to 3, and they're totally separate. But Ember has taken a different approach. Ember uses the major version number as an opportunity to remove old code, and they don't introduce any new APIs. So it's kind of an opportunity to clean house and just kind of prepare the framework and the community for the next year or two. But they try to make it relatively pain-free. Like if you're on the last version of, like right now, if you're on 2.18, which is the final version of the 2.x life cycle, if you're on 2.18 and your app runs and there's no deprecations, you can upgrade to 3.0 pretty much without doing anything. You just bump your version number, run an npm install, and you're on Ember 3.0. So, but there are some things that are going away. So deprecations from the 2.x era are going away. So a deprecation, if you're not familiar, is like code or APIs that were part of the framework and then were removed or marked that they're going to be removed. So throughout the 2.x cycle, there are a lot of APIs that were deprecated. You get warnings in your console if you're using them, and then it's there as an opportunity to kind of upgrade away from those deprecations. And then once we hit a big major version, all that code will go away and is dumped out of the framework, removed. We're also 2.18 is the last version of Ember Core, the core framework that will be available as a Bower package. So Ember is moving completely to NPM. So Ember is now the Ember source package on NPM, and in the 3.0 era, that will be the only way to put Ember or use Ember. And then we're also in 3.0, removing support for IE 9 and 10, so Internet Explorer 9 and 10. So for a lot of the people that are maybe supporting newer browsers, mobile, that kind of thing, this might not be an issue. But for a lot of bigger companies, like where I work, supporting these older browsers can be kind of a big deal. Like right now at RTD, the standard browser install across the company for employees is IE 10. But that's going to be going away in 3.0. So coincidentally, it's going away because Microsoft has actually dropped support for these browsers. So the company that makes the browsers no longer supports them. So these browsers don't get security releases anymore, that kind of thing. So, and when we say they're dropping support for it, that doesn't mean IE 9 and 10 will stop working in 3.0. It basically means that they're going to stop testing the framework against those browsers. So there'll basically be no guarantee anymore that the framework will continue to work on those browsers, and there may be a feature that comes along in a future release in the 3.0 or 3.x cycle that just doesn't work in those browsers. And there won't really be any forewarning because we don't test in it. As far as the migration path, so there's some really important things that the Ember community, the Ember core team has established that kind of support the transition and upgrading. So the first one is LTS releases. So LTS stands for long-term support. These are versions of the framework that are maintained for longer than other releases. So for example, 2.18 was a long-term support release, and it will be maintained until the 3.5 release, which is, if I did the math right, about in like September. And the LTS releases are every 4th release generally, and then 2.18 was kind of a special one because they made it an LTS because of the last one in the 2.x era. There's also an add-on called Ember 2 Legacy. So this will basically allow you to upgrade your app to 3.0 and then install it without doing anything to, or basically without removing the deprecations from 2.x that were removed. So it basically allows backwards compatibility between 2.x APIs and 3.x apps. And that add-on is going to be maintained until the 3.4 release. So all the math together, you've basically got until, if you're on LTS releases, you have until roughly like this fall to upgrade to 3.0 to continue being on the LTS train. Like I said, 3.4 is going to be the first LTS.
So 3.0 is not considered an LTS release?
3.0, yeah, 3.0 is not. Yeah, so it's 2.18 and then 3.4. But that's kind of it for Ember 3.0. Purposely, Ember kind of makes their big major version releases not that exciting. And part of that is, that's partly because of Ember's philosophy, kind of the philosophy that drives the framework, which David will talk about later. Basically, the idea is we want to make the upgrade path easy. Like I said earlier, Ember's been around since 2011, and it's now 2018. So it's kind of lasted a lot longer than pretty much anything else out there in the JavaScript ecosystem. And there are apps that existed back in 2012 that are still keeping up to date and haven't done major rewrites and have been able to upgrade with the framework. But like I said, this isn't really a talk about Ember 3.0. We're really going to talk about the rest of the time about kind of where we come from and where we're going as a framework and as a community. So first, we're going to look back on the 2.x era and kind of see like what happened in the major JavaScript ecosystem over that time, and then kind of within the Ember ecosystem, what happened. So we got this kind of time. So 2.0 came out in August of 2015. So quick caveat, this timeline is not meant to be like exactly chronologically accurate. It's mostly a visual aid, so we can kind of all get on the same page with what has transpired over the last 2.5 years. So down at the beginning, we've got the transition from Angular to Angular 2, 3, 4, and 5. So there's been 5 major versions of Angular throughout this whole time frame. Way back in 2015, Microsoft dropped support for IE 8, 9, and 10. Back in 2016, ES 2015 or ES 6 was finalized and became like an official thing, and Babel was released. So That's like huge, major changes of the JavaScript ecosystem. You know, we had Create React App, Next.js, countless other React boilerplates that kind of came along and have fallen away. So lots of experimentation in the React ecosystem. We had 4 major versions of React Router that are all not compatible with each other and required complete rewrites to, not rewrites, but the APIs were not you know, compatible over those changes. We had Redux, MobX, Flux, and all the other Flux patterns come onto the scene. We had Vue, Apollo, RxJX, a lot of other kind of big pieces of today's JavaScript ecosystem were released since Ember's 2.0 release. WebAssembly hit major browsers. It's now available in most of the major browsers. And then progressive web apps became a thing, and that's now in all the major browsers. So there's just been a lot of stuff that happened just since Ember's 2.0 release back in 2015. And over that time frame, a lot happened in Ember too. So Ember 2.0's release was when the Ember community first moved to synced versioning. So this is the concept that Ember, Ember Data, Liquidfire, Ember's animation library, all these big pieces of the Ember ecosystem, Ember CLI, are now on a synced version number. So you know, as Ember goes from 2.4 to 2.5, all those libraries are going to make that same version bump. We got LTS releases, which is huge for big companies or enterprises that can't be upgrading every 6 weeks. We got an add-on ecosystem. That's like one of Ember's huge strengths, is the add-on ecosystem and just the sheer amount of community code that's been available that you can just install. It's just, you know, Ember install whatever, and now your app does maps, or it does, you know, analytics, or any number of things. We got really big, kind of earth-shaking add-ons like Ember Concurrency, Mirage, the JSON API spec. Again, these didn't necessarily happen like after 2.0 came out, but they kind of came into general awareness in the community and large-scale use in the community. Glimmer.js became a thing. You know, that was announced just a year ago at EmberConf. We'll talk about Glimmer.js a little bit later if you're not familiar, but it's kind of changing or kind of deciding what the future of Ember is going to look like. Ember Observer is a really great resource for discovering add-ons that you can use. That is like a really great website that became a thing. We got huge infrastructure like Ember Fastboot for server-side rendering and Ember Engines. Ember Engines kind of lets you split up your app into chunks that can be maintained and shipped separately. We got Glimmer 2, which was a complete rewrite and overhaul of the rendering engine that's under the hood in Ember. We got really big performance gains and size reductions in the framework from that. Kind of a little bit after Glimmer 2 came around, we started compiling the framework with rollup, or parts of the framework with rollup, which is kind of a technical thing, but it really helped size and performance of the framework a lot. We also got a JavaScript module API, which lets us do real JavaScript like ES imports and exports in our apps, and import pieces of the framework instead of using the Ember global to reference different parts of the framework. You can now just import the parts you need. And then to support the coming of progressive web apps, Ember Service Worker came along. So that's an add-on that makes it really easy to build your Ember app in a way that basically make it a progressive web app using service workers. And then really recently, Ember Source became available on NPM, and we got this really awesome add-on called Ember CLI Update, which basically lets you update your app from one version to another just by running a command in your command line interface. And it's kind of like running Ember init, if you're familiar with that during the upgrade process, but it does everything for you. So you're no longer, it's no longer trying to rewrite like your README file because it doesn't match what's in the Ember new app blueprint. It kind of takes what's already in your app and upgrades the pieces that actually need to be upgraded and not the things that you did on purpose and don't want to change. All right, so next we're going to look forward at what the 3.x era is going to bring to Ember. So some big features that are coming pretty soon that'll be dropping within like, I don't know, probably in the next year or so. We're making jQuery optional. So jQuery has always been part of the Ember framework. It's been used under the hood for some things in the past, and it was used really heavily in Ember's testing package, or the testing ecosystem for Ember. But there's work going on right now to basically remove jQuery, make it optional, and basically everything that the framework used to use jQuery for, it now uses something else. So that'll obviously cut the size of the framework by quite a bit and boost performance, especially if you're not using jQuery for anything else. So Ember source right now is published to NPM as kind of one big package, but there's work going on right now to split it into packages. So like the router would be published as a package, like Ember string, the Ember objects, all these pieces of the Ember framework that have kind of traditionally always been packaged together in one big monolith, if you will, are now going to be separate packages. And this paves the way for this concept of being able to NPM install your way to Ember. So rather than getting the entire framework, which you might not be using all of it, you're basically able to just take the pieces you want. And going along with that, there's work going on to introduce tree shaking and svelte builds. So tree shaking is the concept of the Ember's build process being able to strip out modules or pieces of the framework that your app doesn't even use. So you know, if you never used like Ember's like string package or that kind of thing, it just wouldn't even get shipped to the browser in your build. Svelte builds is similar but a little bit different. So the way Ember works with its versioning is, you know, every version they might deprecate a feature, and that feature is still in the framework and it still gets shipped to browsers. It's just behind a flag, or not necessarily behind a flag, but it's a deprecated feature, and your app might not use it anymore because it's been deprecated. And you know, the happy path is to no longer use deprecated features. So svelte builds will basically let the build process be able to strip out pieces of the framework that you aren't using that have been deprecated, that aren't like at a module level. It's really at like smaller code path level. And so these two things together are going to like drastically reduce the overall size of the framework as a whole. And that's kind of been historically one of the big knocks against Ember, is it's really like heavyweight and includes a lot of things that you might not even need. So and your users kind of end up paying that cost, but very soon that's no longer going to be the case. You kind of use what you need and leave everything else on the cutting room floor of your build. And there's already experimentation on these things happening in add-ons. So there's specifically there's a tree shaking add-on that's already been being worked on that does some of that.
Hey Steve.
Yeah.
I'm not very familiar with tree shaking, but can it be used to see which parts of your code are not being touched? Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question was about tree shaking and whether it can be used to strip out pieces of your code, like your app code, that aren't used. I think the add-on that I mentioned can do some of that. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Can't at the moment, but that's a long term.
Who's that on?
So it's Kelly Selden. So he's one of the core team members. Yeah, so that's being worked on. Yeah. But in general, at the framework level, the framework level tree shaking that'll eventually make its way into Ember CLI is specifically for removing modules from the Ember framework that your app doesn't use.
Is the idea that like if spell builds got good enough that you wouldn't ever need another major release? Like we can just strip out the deprecated things without doing the version bump?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that concept thrown out there, and yeah. So the question for the recording is whether svelte builds can basically remove the need to do major version releases, and it's definitely possible. Like Ben was saying, if the minor versions are deprecating features and your app's not using a feature that was deprecated, the svelte build would allow that to be removed from the framework. So that's totally possible. Yeah.
Steve. Yeah. So if you look at the blog post on 2.17, 2.18, it talks about tree shaking a lot. Is it going to? How much effort is going to be involved to really do effective tree shaking?
As a user, or
yeah, as a developer.
As a developer. So assuming that you've made the transition to the ES module imports and you're importing from the packages, the framework should pretty much take care of it for you.
Okay.
So like if you're on 3.0 and you've removed Ember CLI shims and you're not using shims and you're only importing from the packages, it should, I would assume, be for free. So,
Sweet.
Yeah. So a few more upcoming features. So module unification. So this is RFC that's been in the works for at least a year, probably more. So this is basically changing the way that the file structure of your app is organized. So the module unification RFC. So RFC is Ember's process for proposing changes. It stands for request for comment. So basically, anytime someone wants to make a change to the framework, there's an RFC submitted in GitHub, and then the core team deliberates on that RFC, and then it goes into implementation. So module unification is an RFC that's been approved, finalized, it's in implementation. You can start a new app today using this new file structure, using a blueprint in Ember CLI. And there's also a code mod that will transform a legacy app that's either on the classic file system or the pods file system and transform it into this new format. So you can basically use this today. The new file structure, it's a much more kind of organized, systematically thought out file structure, and it paves the way for code splitting your app and eventually Glimmer components, which again we're going to get to later. And the module unification file layout is available today if you were to start a Glimmer.js app. So that's kind of where the experimentation on that took place, and it's made its way back into Ember work. Code splitting and custom bundles. So this is basically the idea that for each route in your app, each URL, each section of the app, the build process of Ember CLI would be able to spit out a bundle just for that section of the app. So whatever section of the app your user is using, they get the code for that, but not the other parts. So the classic example for this is like an admin dashboard. So like an app that has like the main user feature set and then an admin dashboard. Most of your users might not ever see that admin dashboard, so you wouldn't need to ship that admin dashboard code to the users that aren't even using it. And you'd also be able to like lazy load the rest of your app in the background so that you still get really snappy transitions. Yeah.
Custom bundle question.
Yeah.
Did we get route-specific code bundles for acceptance tests, so we don't have to like start app as much and tear down as much code?
Yeah, I don't know too much about that. I mean, it seems like it makes sense, and if the build can do that, it seems like it could do that as part of the build that is built for your test. So I'm sure that's probably possible. And I know there's also some RFCs around changing the testing framework in general, so I'm not sure how those would mesh.
I could imagine it possibly not actually being more performant, because the purpose of the bundles is to reduce the load time. But with the acceptance tests, you're loading it locally in the browser one time. And with the bundles, with code splitting bundles, it is that if you transition to a different route, you would then request the bundle on the fly, which means another request, which if you're downloading over the actual internet, it might take a long time, so bundles make sense. But if you're downloading from a local host, it might make more sense to download everything in one go, because you're just downloading it to your local browser and then be able to run it. So it might be a trade-off.
Okay. And then the next upcoming feature is basically transitioning the Ember object to ES6 classes. So the Ember object was, when it came out years ago, it was like really forward thinking, and it actually shaped the way in TC39 and kind of shaped the ES6 classes that we have today. So the Ember object kind of existed because we didn't have ES6 classes and the features that ES6 classes give us now. So there's plans to eventually kind of phase out some or all of the Ember object and just replace it with ES6 classes. So that's will be another big performance gain, because there's a lot of kind of cruft and weight associated with the Ember object because we've had it for so long. So that'll be a really nice change. So you may have noticed, if you've been keeping up with things in the Ember world, that routable components have been missing from this discussion. So recently, Yehuda Katz, one of the creators of Ember and core team member, closed the RFC for routable components and basically said, like, when this RFC was proposed, it was a great idea. A few years later, it's no longer such a great idea. So routable components, the RFC actually existed before 2.0 even came out. So it's been around a long time and was never implemented. The idea with routable components is that when you have a route in your application, like a URL, you'd be able to just assign a component to that route instead of right now it's a route controller and a template. You just give it a component. So there are, even though routable components are not actually going to happen now, there are some ideas from routable components that are eventually going to make their way into the framework in the 3.x era. At least that's the plan, at least. So being able to do query parameters without controllers. So right now you have to use a controller to have query parameters in your URL and manage those. So that's not going to be the case in the future. We are going to have the ability to assign a component as the top level template for a route. And then we're also going to be able to have a route supply more than just the model to the template. So currently the route loads some data, it passes that data to the template as a model, a thing called a model. And then with this change, you'd be able to pass other things. So you could call it something other than a model or give it other things besides the model. That'd be the idea there.
I have a quick question, Steve.
Yeah.
So if we're going to be able to do that with the template, why wouldn't we also just use the component, like the JavaScript part of the component for the controller also, because the component owns everything that the
Yeah, so I think it would be both. So it would be a template with a component class.
Well, like, isn't that essentially a routable component at that point?
To clarify, there's no clarity on what will happen here yet.
Okay.
So this is all, it's probably going to happen at some point.
Yeah, this is just based on Yehuda's comment when he closed the RFC, which is a really good read if you want to like read into the thought process of a genius like Yehuda. It's really interesting to read it.
Thank you.
Yeah. It was like good closure for an RFC that's been out there for years that a lot of people expected years ago and never got. So that brings us to Glimmer components. So what about Glimmer components? So there's been all this work by the core team and by big names in Ember like Tom Dale on Glimmer. And I think there's been a little bit of this feeling that, oh, like Ember's not the focus of the core team anymore. They're just focused on Glimmer. But it turns out all that work in Glimmer has been to benefit Ember. And it's been a place to experiment and refine ideas about how the next generation of Ember's templating system and rendering engine should work. So long story short, we are going to get Glimmer components in Ember apps. You will be able to have a Glimmer component that runs in your Ember app. So there are pieces of this already in place. So module unification, which we already talked about, brings the Glimmer.js file system into Ember apps. So I think eventually that will probably be like you will have to transition your app to the new file structure to benefit from this. Also, as of last year's EmberConf, or I'm sorry, the 2.15 release of Ember had the same underlying Glimmer VM version that they launched Glimmer.js with at EmberConf last year. So that version of Glimmer.js, the Glimmer VM that they showed off, is in Ember already. And then according to a video released today by the Ember Map podcast, they interviewed Tom Dale. In time for EmberConf this year, 2018, Ember Core will have the exact same Glimmer VM that Glimmer.js has.
Damn.
So that's like huge. If you don't know what Glimmer is, that probably means nothing to you, but Glimmer is basically a complete rewrite of like the rendering engine and templating system of Ember, and it's a huge deal. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more because we're going to go more into depth on Glimmer separately. But and then aside from the pieces that are already in place for Glimmer, there's a bunch of small RFCs that are currently out there that will get us the rest of the way there. So one of those is bringing TypeScript into Ember. So there's already add-ons to allow you to do that today. So TypeScript is like a superset of JavaScript that lets you add strong types into your JavaScript app, or typing in general. We're going to get angle bracket components. So that's like the syntax for a Glimmer component. So you'll be able to use that syntax in an Ember app to use a Glimmer component in your Ember app. So some differences here. A current Ember component is like double curlies. with generally lowercase and dashed, like so kebab case component names. So we're moving to uppercase component names. And they've also made a change. So right now in Ember, anything you pass into the component, you just pass in as like bar equals whatever. So they're introducing this @ sign. So that's when you want to pass in like just arbitrary data or arguments to the component. So like if there's some state that you need to pass in, like is open or is expanded, you could pass that in as @ is expanded equals true or false. And then the like unnamed attributes that you pass in would correspond to like actual HTML attributes that should exist on that element that gets created by that component. So that's like until now we've never had that distinction, but now there'll be a very clear distinction as to like what has been passed into the component and what has not. And then inside the component, anything that does not have the @ sign will be like local to the component. So if you have some property that you've defined in the component, that will just be without the @ sign, and then you will know that anything that's passed in has the @ sign. We're also getting ES6 classes with native getters and setters. So this will remove the ember.get, ember.set, this.get, this.set that is all over the place in Ember code. So it's a huge quality of life change that we will all learn to love. And there's also, currently there is an RFC that removes the need to use this.get inside computed properties. So if you have a computed property and you're getting something, you can just do like, it's just this dot whatever you need, not this dot get the thing.
It's an RFC or an add-on?
I think it's an RFC. There might be an add-on, and there's like other add-ons that kind of make some of this like automatic, like you don't have to specify keys for computed properties. But this is an RFC, the current, like you don't need getters. And they're doing the getters and setters separately. So right now they're just gonna solve the getters problem, and then later they're gonna figure out what to do about setters. But it turns out we set a lot less frequently in computed properties than we do yet. So this will solve like a lot of people's issues. We're also getting template-only components. So if you can, like currently in Ember, if you have a component that's like basically just a wrapper for a bunch of HTML that doesn't like have any logic of its own, you still have to give it like a component JavaScript file even if there's nothing in it. This will give us the ability to like just have a template that doesn't have an associated JavaScript file. And I think the template-only components that we're going to get as part of this RSC are actually like basically Glimmer components. Like it will be a Glimmer component.
So I was just looking at this last night. Like, isn't that basically just a partial? Because I didn't see partials listed anymore in the guide. Is there like partials are dead?
Yeah, partials are dead. That's one of the 2.x deprecations that's being removed.
But so sounds like that's just bringing that back, but with the better VM.
Yeah, so basically if you have a template-only component, once this RFC gets merged in, that component will be a Glimmer component. It will, under the hood, it will use Glimmer. It won't use Ember component. So
I think there's some edge cases around the difference between partials versus components in terms of like the scope. Like a component creates the entire
Oh
state.
yeah, because a partial just literally dropped in the HTML, so it's in the same scope.
Yeah.
All right.
You could end up with some weird stuff going on with partials that if they just call it a component and go, this is a template-only component, it's a lot.
And it has like no outside like scope leakage in it. Okay, that makes sense.
And there's an add-on that does that today, right? I heard on the Ember Map podcast that Miguel Camda wrote an add-on.
Oh, so he has an add-on. He has an add-on that will like basically in your build process, it'll take a component and turn it into just static HTML. It like pre-processes it. So it's like, I think the example they used was for like Font Awesome. So with the Ember Font Awesome add-on, everything, all the font icons or whatever are components. So every time you like use an icon, you're instantiating a component in your app. But Miguel's update to Font Awesome, and I think there's an add-on as well. In your build process, it sees all those components that don't need to be components, and it just turns them into HTML. That's what that is. Yeah. The last thing on here is decorator support. So decorator is like a very experimental syntax that Glimmer.js uses kind of instead of computed properties, basically to indicate that a property should be tracked for changes. And decorators have until recently been like very early on in like the TC39 acceptance stage of actually making their way into JavaScript. So currently, decorators are not a thing in JavaScript. It's basically something that has been proposed as a feature that could exist, and we use Babel to compile it away into a bunch of ugly JavaScript. So we recently found out that TC39 has moved up decorators, that they're probably going to make their way into JavaScript and become a real thing. And that's very good for Ember because it means we can actually like use them freely and not feel guilty that we're introducing fake syntax that is not real. Because again, the decorators are like pretty key part of Glimmer.js, so that'll be that's a really big thing for Ember to get that. So now we're going to talk about just like in general, like how the experiment of Glimmer.js will pay off for Ember apps and Ember developers. So there's a few, like I've listed 6 like big things here that are big payoffs, and I kind of want to start by talking about the reason that Glimmer has been such a success for Ember and has even been possible is Ember kind of made this bet early on that having templates that are not just JavaScript, like templates that are their own templating language, was a good thing for a number of reasons. So it turns out that templates, like handlebars templates that are used in Ember, they can be like statically analyzed and optimized. You can basically change how it works under the hood, how those templates get turned into JavaScript and rendered to a browser's web page. You can change all that under the hood without changing the template. And in Ember, we've actually seen that happen like twice or 3 times now, where the Ember framework, while keeping the same templating language, has completely ripped out the inner workings of the rendering engine and replaced it with something bigger and better. And so Glimmer is like the next stage in that. And it's something that just like, if you're familiar with React and JSX, just like wouldn't be possible with JSX. Because you have no idea what could be happening inside JSX. Like, there's no way to know that. And there's like, it's just JavaScript, so all it can ever be is just JavaScript. But with templates and Ember and handlebars, we have that freedom to optimize and change how they work under the hood. So the first big gain is this much nicer capital component syntax that we're going to get, and that's mostly just like aesthetically more pleasing. And it's just easier to see what's a component in your template. The next big payoff is going to be ES6 classes, which we talked about a little bit already, and that's basically just going to like remove a large part of the Ember object and kind of the less pleasant parts of the Ember object that we have to deal with right now. And then binary templates. So this is like a big thing you could talk about for hours. But basically, the big performance gain of Glimmer is that it takes your template and it compiles it down to like binary code. And instead of shipping a bunch of JavaScript to the browser or a bunch of JSON to the browser or a bunch of strings to the browser that all have to be parsed, we now have these binary templates that can be loaded into the browser without a parse step. So it turns out parsing JavaScript is really slow. Parsing JSON, which is what we do now in Ember, is less slow, but it's still kind of slow. Parsing binary, there is no parse, so it's super fast. It can basically be streamed in and rendered as it is received by the browser. And another kind of part of that is Glimmer is able to split your template into a render step, like the instructions the browser needs to like render your template, and then a separate set of instructions for updating that template. And it turns out that that is very performant and really helps both of those steps. Whereas like right now in like any virtual DOM implementation, it's the same logic. Like every time something changes in the template, the virtual DOM has to like re-render the entire DOM tree. And I think there's some work being done to improve that in React. But in Glimmer, it's actually 2 separate programs. One's in charge of initial render, the other is in charge of updates. And because we have templates that are static, the Ember CLI, when it builds the templates, it can see exactly which parts of your template can change and which parts are just HTML that will never change. And it can optimize how it updates those things that can change. The next thing we're going to get is kind of like server-side rendering and incremental rehydration. So server-side rendering is just the concept that you've got this client-side JavaScript app that can also be rendered on the server, and you get the best of both worlds for like initial load time and the interactivity you get with a client-side app. And then incremental rehydration is this idea that like right now, if you server render a JavaScript app, as soon as the JavaScript package loads up, your page just like re-renders the whole thing, and you lose anything that's happened in between. So incremental rehydration would basically allow the server-side render page to load immediately, and then as the JavaScript loads in and takes over, it wouldn't just blow away the DOM. It would see what's already in the DOM and attach itself to that DOM that's already rendered, and basically turn a server-rendered page into a interactive page without blowing it all away. We're also going to get incremental rendering. So this kind of sounds boring, but it's like a huge step forward in how we render JavaScript apps. So basically, it puts the render step of the app into request animation frame, which is a browser API that allows the browser to tell your JavaScript when is a good time to do work. And it basically like speeds up by a lot, like how fast your app is able to be rendered. It stops your JavaScript from blocking the browser and preventing things like keyboard input and that kind of thing while renders are happening. And it just vastly improves like how your app gets rendered and how fast it gets rendered. It's the kind of thing that you really have to see like side-by-side comparisons of, and Tom Dale has those. He gave a talk pretty recently that's pretty impressive to see what they've been able to accomplish in Glimmer.js using like all these processes or all these capabilities together. And then the last one is WASM, WebAssembly-based rendering engine. So this is the idea that the entire rendering engine of Glimmer would be moved into a WebAssembly process that's running off the main thread of the browser. So any work that the browser needs to do to figure out like what the interface should look like in the next render happens off the main thread, and the main thread is just reserved for your app logic and dealing with user interaction. And you no longer have these big, render processes blocking the browser thread for a long time in ways that are noticeable to the user. So all these things together, I think, are really going to like modernize Ember and kind of really start allowing it to compete like really strongly with the frameworks that have come along in the last couple of years that have had the luxury of being written in the last couple of years from scratch. Again, Ember has been around for like 7 years now. It does have a lot of baggage that it's gained over those 7 years, but it's also, there are a lot of huge apps that have existed for those 7 years, and that's hugely beneficial for Ember developers and the ecosystem. So again, all this stuff, all these awesome gains from Glimmer will eventually make their way into Ember, and that's kind of been like the grand plan of the core team all along, even though it maybe hasn't always seemed that way. Maybe it didn't seem like that at EmberConf last year. But that has been the plan, and it turns out it was a good plan and will hopefully benefit all of us. So I think David's going to take over from here, and I'll let David take over.
So that's a lot of great information. It's also a lot of real in-depth technical stuff. We're going to change gears a bit. As Steve's been talking, he's been talking about a lot of the nuts and bolts, but what provides the coherence and organization to all this? And we've got all these new ideas, different experiments, Glimmer.js seemingly not being directly tied, and then it was. Generally with this type of framework, with most communities, there's some sort of underlying philosophy or worldview that kind of architects and shapes the whole community. So I find it's quite helpful to look at those pieces in the interest of understanding where we're going. And it also helps to look at where the leaders have come from in the interest of understanding how they think about the world. For Ember, over the years, there have been two major influences. One is the Rails community. Yehuda Katz, who's one of the implementers of Ember, was on the Rails core team for a number of years. And so a lot of what you see in the Rails world bleeds into Ember. There's differences, but by and large, Rails doctrines and Rails approaches, Rails philosophy of how things should work, by and large translates to Ember. There's a Rails doctrine on their webpage. It's kind of a manifesto about how they view the world. And reading that, Yehuda Katz is like, yeah, that's ours. Now, if you go look at it, it's pretty Rails-centric, but a lot of those thoughts, I was given permission to go copy that and put it on the Ember website. We'd tweak it, but that's kind of the thinking. The other one is Apple. Tom Dale, who's one of the other key guys in Ember, worked on the first version of iCloud at Apple using Sprout Core, which is a predecessor to Ember. And so Apple's philosophy of things also affected Ember historically, but has also affected the thinking of the leadership of Ember. Things like controlling your own complete stack, an integrated solution, those types of thoughts are of benefit, and you can see that played out in Ember's ecosystem. Things like wanting to run not just the view layer, but also the data layer and other aspects. Steve Jobs is regularly quoted and thought about by these guys. This came up on Twitter today. Steve Jobs is the enemy of nostalgia. And you can kind of see this attitude played out in the Ember 2.0 to Ember 3 shift. We're going to kill Bower. We're going to kill deprecated code. They've worked hard on keeping Ember published to Bower for the whole 2.x cycle in the interest of supporting people behind the scenes. But the handwriting's been on the wall for a long time that Ember on Bower was going away. If you had old build processes that use that, you're going to need to shift those around. And so those are some of the influences that affect Ember. And those influences in turn affect the key values that shape a lot of what affects us on a day-to-day basis. Two of the ones that get mentioned heavily are stability without stagnation and building shared solutions. For the first, for framework developers, and as app developers, we're primarily wanting the framework to keep working. But at some point, if you just want things to be stable, you will also fall behind the technical curve and you're no longer relevant. There's a number of JavaScript libraries out there that people built apps on that came out at the same time Ember did that haven't been upgraded since. At this point, those no longer help people build the type of applications that people want to build today. So the trade-off as a framework developer is how to help move a whole group of people over time towards newer solutions without killing off their apps and losing them completely. With shared solutions, again, as a framework developer, how do you help this whole community work together versus building things separately? Those are things that you see the Rails world grappling with and having worked on improving, and it's also something Ember has really worked on as well. For the stability without stagnation value, we're really wrestling with what enables a long-term framework to exist in an ecosystem that by and large changes every few years. And there's the latest flavor of the month when it comes to JavaScript. Vue.js came out, which is taking a lot of the interest away from React, and before that it was Angular, and before that, and it's gone on and on and on. So how do you build something that lasts for a long time that people don't just throw away because like, oh, that's no use anymore. That's for the old fogies. And in the midst of being stable, how do you prevent things from breaking? Here again is that quote. Like Steve mentioned, the Python 2 to 3, the Angular 1 to 2 types of transitions can destroy communities to the point they don't ever recover. Rails had this as well in the Rails 2 to Rails 3 transition, where people like GitHub's now on Rails 3, but Rails 3 came out when? Do you remember, Ben?
It would have been like
2009, 2010?
A long time ago, because they're on Rails 5 too.
Right. And they're going towards Rails 6. And so the transition from Rails 2 to Rails 3 stopped some major contributors to the Rails ecosystem from upgrading for years. I ran into this recently with a client of my own where framework went from version 1 to version 2, and although it looked similar, everything had changed under the hood, and it took us well over a year to upgrade. Where I'm trying to shift the app into new features, but I've got to deal with this whole framework transition as well. It was quite a disaster. So Ember's approach in the long run really helps businesses that have bet heavily on this framework, keep it from blowing up. Steve talked about the deprecations, the Bower packages, the removal of IE9 and IE10. We don't want to be stuck with IE9, IE10 code for the long run. So those types of philosophical approaches are really what undergirds a lot of the changes over time. Is how we want to keep your app running, supporting IE9, IE10 for a while, but we've got to kill it at some point. Another idea that's pretty important is this idea of shared defaults or shared abstractions, as they're known. Common things that we all do together as a community where we wrestle with how does that look as a group in the interest of all being able to work on it together. There's a really good video of Yehuda Katz talking about this a number of years ago. It's just 3 or 4 years ago. We'll see if the audio works here.
And I think fundamentally this is about sort of the history of programming, is that we have shared solutions. We make progress by building up the stack, by eliminating code that we didn't have to write. And Steve Jobs actually talked about this in 1995, sort of exactly the same thing. So let him talk.
Because it's all about managing complexity, right? You're developers, you know that. It's all about managing complexity. It's like scaffolding, right? You erect some scaffolding, and if you keep going up and up and up, eventually the scaffolding collapses of its own weight, right? That's what building software is. It's how much scaffolding can you erect before the whole thing collapses of its own weight. Doesn't matter how many people you have working on it. Doesn't matter if you're Microsoft with 300, 400 people, 500 people on the team. It will collapse under its own weight. You've read The Mythical Man Month, right? Basic premise of this is a software development project gets to a certain size where if you add one more person, the amount of energy to communicate with that person is actually greater than their net contribution to the project, so it slows down. So you have local maximum and then it comes down. We all know that about software. It's about managing complexity. These tools allow you to not have to worry about 90% of the stuff you've worried about so that you can erect your 5 stories of scaffolding, but starting at story number 23 instead of starting at story number 6. You can get a lot higher.
And I think that's fundamentally what we do as software people. For all of the complaints that people make about, you know, oh my God, every abstraction leaks, all we've ever done, even as far back as, you know, in the 60s, but even in 1995, Steve Jobs was already talking about this idea that we can build higher by building shared solutions. And I'm going to let him speak one more time because I think really, it's really fascinating how much this idea of how you get better programmer productivity hasn't really changed fundamentally since that time.
But on top of that, we're going to put something called OpenStep. And OpenStep lets you start developing your apps on the 20th floor. And the kinds of apps you can deliver are phenomenal. But there's another hidden advantage. Most of the great breakthroughs, the page makers, the illustrators, etc., the directors, come from smaller software companies. It's been said a few times today. They don't come from the large software companies. They come from the smaller ones. And one of the greatest things is that using this new technology, 2 people or 3 people in a garage can build an app and get it from concept to market in 6 to 9 months that is every bit as feature rich, every bit as reliable, and every bit as exciting as a giant software company can do with a 150-person team. It's phenomenal.
So that's really what we're looking at here in the midst of talking about shared solutions, is as a community working on experimenting, both all the crazy experimentation that Steve's talking about, where there's lots of new ideas, where people are trying new things. But over time, building up to the point that we're experimenting up here, but these types of things, by and large, those issues have been solved as a community, where we've wrestled with those things, we've worked through them. So in the Ember world, some examples of those have been the Ember router was something that really stalled Ember 1.0 from coming out as the community wrestled with how do we want this to work. And eventually they figured out this is something that we think we're comfortable with for the long haul, and they put it out there. And then Ember 1.0 and others came along. Ember CLI is another example of that. Your app came out, you guys started working on it, Ember 1.6, you said, before Ember CLI came along. At that time, build tooling within Ember, it was up for grabs. Everyone did it differently. And so Ember CLI came along in there where people were experimenting with different approaches. Like, this one doesn't work. This one doesn't work. This one's got some good ideas, but it's going to blow up in the long run. They eventually came out with Ember CLI. At which point, the community started thinking, okay, we've experimented enough. This is the solution where after we'll all shift away from an era of experimentation to one of, this is what we want to work on, now we'll improve it together. And so the idea of both allowing flexibility to explore new things, but also taking those things that we've experimented with and at some point deciding this is good enough, as a community we'll improve it together, has been really helpful. In Ember at this point, a lot of that's done within add-ons, but it's kind of a blessed location for that type of experimentation to occur. And so you can see it in the Ember 2 add-on that will exist for a while. This supports this type of feature for longer than we really want in the base Ember thing, and at some point we'll throw that away. And so it kind of allows the community to do some interesting things. But there in itself, an add-on is a shared abstraction we've all agreed on. That an add-on is allowed to do these types of things to my app in all sorts of interesting ways. And in the midst of working on shared defaults, it's also good to steal from other people. We've done that with Angular. Angular had some really interesting test stuff that Ember originally didn't have. And with React's approach to how data was handled, and with Vue, in some ways, the being able to go from lighter all the way up to heavier, the whole npm install approach, or npm install your way to Ember, is Ember's flavor of how Vue.js can handle things, but flavored by how Ember views the world. There's a Steve Jobs quote that gets quoted, good artists copy, great artists steal. And so Ember's quite happy to talk about that. And so these are really the things that ultimately set Ember apart as a different type of framework. That in the midst of the discussion of all the little technical details, it's easy to lose track of. That we're getting incremental DOM rendering is really amazing. But that's really experimentation around the view layer and how that can go faster. That we're seeing experimentation in other areas, and I've heard people talking about improvements they'd like to make to the router. Well, over time, the splitting up of Ember into separate packages will allow us to swap pieces out and experiment with new ideas there without breaking the whole ecosystem. And so here again, as we look at Ember 3.0, a lot of the new ideas, a lot of the new approaches that they're thinking about are really in service to how do you both allow the community to experiment with things while keeping things stable and keeping my app functioning tomorrow. And so the shared solutions help with that. It prevents the ecosystem from churning a lot. And fundamentally, all of those approaches to things come out of a community-guided approach to open source. If you've got one big company guiding most of the things, their viewpoint on it can be very different than if it's a small company with a few developers. Facebook's been quite good about keeping React stable because they've got so much they've got to support. But Facebook has no control over the rest of the React ecosystem. And so that's kind of a crapshoot as far as how you go about seeing that play out over time, like with all the React router versions. But with Ember's approach to we control it all, then their approach protects smaller development shops. I mean, you've got you working on all the RTD apps, right? And I'm working on a few where it's just me. And then there's LinkedIn, and they've got hundreds of developers. If LinkedIn calls all the shots, I'm toast. And if I call all the shots, LinkedIn's never going to be able to deal with the scale that they're wrestling with. And so what you see with the Glimmer.js experimentation is them experimenting with ideas that LinkedIn's going to need without breaking my app today. And once it's stable enough, then they roll that back into Ember, and I get LinkedIn's work without having to pay the stability cost. And that's really where Ember's approach to things is really amazing in my mind. So, any questions?
First, how about a round of applause? Yeah. That was like maybe like the most beautiful summary of like Ember's philosophy. It's great. Like 5 years. Questions? Mr. Baker.
Well, and for Steve too.
Could you put your contact info?
Yeah. Let's see if I can figure out how to. There you go. Yeah.
I have some upgrade path questions.
Yeah.
So I recently went, well, our company recently went from 2.10 to 2.14. We used Ember CLI update. That part of it was beautiful. And the Ember deprecation guides were also great. What was another add-ons? Like deprecation
workflow.
That was great. What wasn't great is the upgrade path for Ember data.
Yeah. Ember data had problems from about 2.12 to 2.16.
Yep.
So landing at 2.14 wasn't good.
It's really bad, and it's bad right now.
Yeah. So I'd recommend you actually upgrade just Ember data to 2.16, even if you don't. Yeah. Because there's a lot. I've got an app that stopped at 2.12, and I went to 2.13. Like, no, I've got bugs here, so I just stayed at 2.12.
It was like 2.12, and I kept pushing, pushing forward.
If you get to 2.15, 2.16 at that point, Ember data stabilizes.
Well, that's nice to know.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it was unpleasant there for a while. They've been working on improving the code. It was fairly messy in there for a while, so they're trying to lighten Ember data and make it more intelligible over time. But there's a lot of edge cases in there that they're still working out. And so they made some changes in 2.13 that a lot of people weren't happy about. But they've got them ironed out at this point.
Well, what do you expect to see from the 3.0 cycle?
I think it should continue slimming down. And in the long run, they're hoping to allow experimentation with Ember data a bit. And we've seen a lot of stuff with Redux and other things like that in the larger JavaScript world that people in Ember are looking at going, now, what's good about that? What's bad about it? How do we incorporate those ideas into Ember in a way that feels like Ember and doesn't break my app, but allows other things to unlock? And so over time, I think that's the type of stuff we'll begin to see with Ember data, is that we're trying to introduce new primitives there that then allow adding in other libraries that you can do different types of things with.
It kind of feels like Ember data might be pausing for moving people to ES6 classes.
Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff there. Dan Gebhardt, who's on the core team, has a library called Orbit.js, and it's got more of the Flux type data flow patterns to it, which allows some really interesting things. And he's talking to the Ember data folks. What I would imagine is that they wouldn't only bless Orbit, but they might allow unlocking that and play people off against each other and just kind of see what ends up being a good fit for the community. It's really kind of fun to see. It's like, well, okay, this is good enough. Okay, it isn't good anymore. How do we take it out and go, people, tear this apart, come up with your best ideas. Okay, now let's put those back in, bake them in. So
I would like tag that with, like, I like Ember data, but I know a lot of other people don't, especially people outside of the Ember ecosystem, and like that's a thing that's holding them back from it. And I will say that the Ember experience and the Ember data experience feels very different. Because like you might remember a post by Tom Dale, like in the earlier Framework Wars era, when it was like, Angular uses all these wonky words. We use common sense plain language. Ember data feels really wonky. With like how all of those different fucking methods call each other. Like it's a rat's nest. And like no other part of Ember is like that.
And I think they'd love to see that clean up over time. One of the things that we don't currently do a very good job on in the guides is explaining that Ember data is optional. And so you can just send in straight JavaScript data or bring in your other JavaScript libraries if you want to. But that's another discussion as far as why it's not clarified a little more. But I hear Tom Dale, or I see on Twitter, Tom Dale and Yehuda asking questions about Redux, asking questions about other state libraries. The core team's actively looking at other things. But one of the constraints to any new thing will be that it doesn't break everybody else. So that's going to be an interesting thing to see play.
More questions for Steve or David? Going once. Going twice. Guys, thank you so much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for choosing to spend your evenings with us. Thank you to our speakers this evening. Thank you to our sponsors. Especially thank you to Frankie for letting us hang out in his living room all the goddamn time. And also, thank you for your survey responses also. The administrators met earlier this evening. We're talking about how we want 2018 to look, and oh boy, do we have some really good plans for how we're going to make this a great year. So we don't have any pizza left. I think we have a couple of beers, but by all means, please hang out, chat, mingle, get to know some folks. Again, thank you so much for being here tonight.